My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. Hello everybody, I'm today with Dr. Phillip Petersen, a legendary person if someone knows the history of the Cold War, a good friend. Hi Phil, welcome to Poland.
Thank you, nice to be here again.
As I have you here, if you just could tell me a little bit more about this Cold War story in the 80s, when you found out that, according to the press release at least that I read, that the Soviet Union was about to collapse.
Well, I had come across a draft document that had been circulated in Germany prior to, or actually in preparation for Gorbachev's first official visit to Germany, to the Federal Republic. And it said all kinds of, and by the way, this document was given to me by a German intelligence officer who was actually operating undercover as a newsman, which is something illegal to do in the United States. He gave me this paper, and I just couldn't believe it. Essentially, to summarize it, the paper was arguing the European Union was a train moving out of the station, and the Russian economy was actually collapsing already, or had collapsed. So in order to save the Soviet Union, they had to, the conclusion was that they had to end the division of Europe. And to end the division of Europe, they had to end the division of Germany. To end the division of Germany, they had to allow it to be reunified in NATO. And that was absolutely shocking. So I brought the paper back to Washington and gave it to Andy Marshall, the director of net assessment. He read it and he was astounded, and he said, I want you to find out everything you can about this paper. I want you to go to Germany, shake this German intelligence officer until he tells you what the source was, and then go to Moscow and engage the source. And as it turned out, the paper was actually drafted by Bartosiak. And so I showed up in Moscow, went to his office, and I tossed a copy of the paper on his desk, and all of a sudden this great big grin comes on his face. And he said, how did you get this, and how did you find out that I was the author? And so I told him the background, and I said, so now you tell me about the paper. And he said, well, I drafted the paper for the obvious reasons that, like I had already talked to Tatiana Zalsovskaya, who said that, she did the Novosibirsk paper, predicting the possible collapse of the Soviet Union, economic collapse, and the CIA had gotten a hold of that paper, and I read it, and I had a chance to interview her, and she said that, when she predicted the future collapse of the economic collapse of the Soviet Union, the Comic-Con people came and said, hey, the truth is the economy is already in decline. So what you're predicting is already happening right now. And so Bartosiak, who was part of this group that had been at one time originally Otto Kusinen's consultants, and then after Kusinen, his deputy was promoted, Yuri Andropov, so it became the Andropov Circle. And so these guys sort of disappeared in Novosibirsk after the great cardinal, Suslov, eliminated his competition, in quotes, eliminated, by nominating him as the general secretary of the CPSU. And everyone knows, I'm sorry, it's the reverse. He nominated him as the head of the KGB. because everyone knew that if you were, ever since Beria, if you were the head of the KGB, you could no longer, you ruled out becoming the head of the chairman of the CPSU. And so they thought it was over, all his people in the Andropov circle. And so they positioned themselves out in Siberia where they could continue to do their research undisturbed by Moscow. And when, Andropov had two proteges. One was having a senior moment here. One of his proteges was, help me here.
Let's just skip it. I think it's narrative itself, it's much more interesting, than the names. Just carry on.
So anyway, what happened was when Gorbachev came to power, and I was trying to think of his name, one of the two proteges. The other was the Georgian who became the foreign minister. Shevardnadze. That's right. So those are the two proteges. Matter of fact, I have pictures of these guys as young men at visiting Andropov's dacha. And so when he became general secretary, they all of a sudden came back. And they prepared this paper in a panic because the Soviet Union was collapsing. And so, as I realized, or I came to realize as I did the researches, this had a long history, went right back to the beginning of the revolution. There were two kinds of communists. There were the true believers, and then there were the gangsters, the knuckle-dragging thugs. And as we all know from the current leader of Russia, in the end, the knuckle-dragging thugs won.
Yeah.
So
and what happened next? I mean, back in DC and all this turmoil that
when I came back,
you unleashed.
I briefed Andy, and Andy said, write it up. I wrote it up. He took the paper to the Secretary of Defense. And the paper had been approved for release, and it got picked up by the Washington Times, and it would have been front page, but the day it was printed was the same day Lithuania declared its independence. So the article was pushed to page 3, off the front page, and of course, it ended up having me exiled to the National Defense University, where I could be dismissed as a crazy academic, because who could possibly believe the Soviet Union was going to collapse? So that's sort of the story of that, and then at NDU, every year, National Defense University in Washington, Fort McNair, and the NATO Defense College in Rome have a conference, and they alternate back and forth. That year, in 91, it was, I think, April in Washington, and I was invited to make a presentation, which I did. 18 months later, all the papers from the conference were published in a volume by the National Defense University, except one. So my paper was not published. So when the volume came out, the preface was written by the admiral who was the head of NDU, president of NDU. And so I got an appointment with him and came in and said, you see this book, do you remember writing this introduction where you said, who could have imagined when this conference took place that the Soviet Union would not exist by the end of the year? You wrote those words. And here's the one paper, I tossed it on his desk, the one paper that wasn't presented in the book. that was presented at the conference. The title of the paper was 13 Reasons Why the Soviet Union Won't Exist by the End of the Year. So the worst thing in Washington is not being wrong. The worst thing in Washington is being right. If you're wrong, people can forgive you. But if you're right, that means they were wrong. Nobody can forgive that.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. And tell me also, because you are sort of the person dealing with the red thread, analysis of the Soviet troops, Soviet army dispositions, posture in Eastern Germany and across the Fulda Gap thing in the 80s. Just if you just could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I imagine you're looking for this comparison that you've seen between the Fulda Gap and the Suwalki Gap or Suwalki Corridor.
Exactly.
And it's just first of all the Suwalki Gap or the Fulda Gap was a gross misunderstanding. The biggest problem that the West has in understanding the planning, operational planning of the Russian General Staff, or then the Soviet General Staff, is a matter of scale. You know, we maneuver divisions and sometimes corps, and maybe we think about an army group. And a division for the Russian General Staff is a tactical scale formation. So and it was the same problem the Germans had during the Second World War. The German Corps commander was reporting back that he was winning the battle, but in fact, he was being encircled because the Russians think on a larger scale. And so we were focusing, the U.S. Army was focusing on defending the Fulda Gap. And it was a tactical problem. And of course, because we were expecting an attack, the Russians would give us an attack. We might even have been winning at that battle. But the main event would have been operational strategic encirclement of the Central Army Group. And so the Cold War understanding of the importance of the Fulda Gap was wrong then at the time. So obviously when you try to compare it to an event or circumstances today, it's going to be wrong again. When you look at what is now being referred to as the Suwalki Corridor, does it make sense to defend a piece of terrain by putting troops on the target? Because of the range of Russian artillery, the corridor can be closed with artillery fire from Kaliningrad and Belarus. So it's insane to think that somehow you're going to keep the corridor open by putting troops on the target. There is a legitimate problem, and the issue that it raises is that we have a LOC, a line of communication. It's almost 1,000 kilometers from Warsaw to Tallinn. That is a problem because of the proximity of Belarus and Kaliningrad. So when you talk about how we have to think about that problem and dealing with that problem, you really have to talk about how do you suppress, at a minimum, Russian artillery fires from both Kaliningrad and Belarus. So what we need to be thinking about now is if you're going to keep the corridor open, you have to think now about suppressing the Russian forces in Kaliningrad and any Russian forces operating in Belarus. So the idea that somehow we can fight on NATO territory and address this problem is just silly. And I think the better comparison of this Suwalki Corridor is looking at the Versani Gate in Romania. There are something that,
between Galas and Focșani, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Exactly, because from the Russian standpoint, those two corridors are crucial to winning a war with the West. The Russian army is much smaller than the Soviet army, which means their options are very limited. When you look at the general staff operational exercises, all the Zapad exercises, okay, all of them are what I believe should be characterized as war termination operations. If a full-scale war occurs between NATO and the Russian Federation, the Russian General Staff has to find a way to bring it to an end before Russia loses. And so all of those operations and their thinking are ways to get in the north, Poland to stop fighting. And now they're looking at how to use Romania as the back door to Western Europe. So if the fighting occurs actually not in Poland, but in fact in Kaliningrad and in Belarus or in Ukraine, then the Russians have to think about even larger scale encirclement by encircling forces in Central Europe by coming through Romania in the south. So those are the ways, that's how Russian General Staff thinks about the problem. And for them, their entire history has been an issue of encirclement. You never fight more than one battle of penetration. So your battle of penetration is to get your armies into the rear of your opponent. You encircle their forces and don't let them set up a subsequent line of defense so you can destroy them. Because the most expensive stage of any offensive is the battle of penetration. By Russian standards, 50% of their combat potential losses will occur during the first 24 hours during the battle of penetration. So you can't afford to fight that battle more than once. And when you look at the way they have conducted operations in Ukraine, it's the same thing. Every battle has been a battle of encirclement. And the other lesson we should take out of it is it's always been for control of railroad junctions. Rail is how the Russian army moves.
Interesting. Could you tell us more about this, the terrain, the Baltic states, and also northeastern Poland, and how it channels the movement, and what sort of a posture, preferably or optimally, NATO should take, in your personal opinion? Well,
we did a book on this terrain, the northeast quadrant of the Baltic states and the northeast quadrant of Poland, that is framed by the lower Vistula and the Bug rivers. And for the Russians, NATO putting forces into the corridor leaves them very vulnerable, because they would have to withdraw or move back through the Lake District, which is difficult terrain to move. It limits, for example, you wouldn't want American M1 tanks maneuvering in that terrain. Maybe the Leopard 2, because it's much lighter, and certainly the Russian tanks have a better opportunity to maneuver there. So for them, the idea of using the lower Vistula and the Bug rivers as sort of protecting the flanks of an encirclement operation of NATO forces in the north is their solution to the fact that NATO, or was their solution, let me put it that way, to the fact that NATO began to prepare to defend the Baltic states. This myth that the RAND exercises created, that the Russian army could be in Riga in 36 hours. The Russian army couldn't get there with a police escort in 36 hours. If you've ever watched the Russian army and how it breaks down, the terrain is difficult to take and easy to defend in the Baltic states if you defend forward.
Defend forward, not the capital
forward.
cities, you know.
Oh, that's defending the capital city is a disaster. That's precisely what the Russians would want us to do.
Cascading effect, yeah, I think we discussed
And
that.
if you lose, for example, if you lose the forward area in Estonia, that puts pressure on Latvia. If you lose the forward area in Latvia, that puts pressure on Lithuania. People think, well, the shortest distance between Belarus and Kaliningrad is right through the current and the pre-war capitals. Those are built-up areas. That is not the way. If you need to make a rapid advance, the Russians would probably want to cut through from starting at Daugavpils and then cut straight laterally into Kaliningrad, because that's the best tank country in terms of mobility. And just, we walked all that terrain over 4 years. We did the same assessment that the Russians do. As a matter of fact, when we were doing southeast Estonia, the same week we were doing it, there was a Russian team doing it for the Russians. Not because it was new to them, but updating their information. So, now, if we take advantage of the opportunities we have, and I think the big game changer for NATO was when it became obvious to the Russian general staff that Sweden and Finland would fight with the European Union. They would honor their European Union commitments. That fundamentally changed the entire theater of strategic military action, because now NATO had depth in the north. Instead of a narrow, Baltic states, you had all the way to the North Atlantic. Now we're talking about turning the Baltic Sea into a European lake. So that's why you saw a fundamental change in the Zapad exercise in 2017. Instead of 2 landing operations in the Baltic, you had 1. And then you had another landing for Greg, what was the islands up there that we did the exercise on? Svalbard. The Russians practiced taking Svalbard. They have to somehow drive the NATO out of the North Atlantic. So now, instead of isolating the Baltic states and Poland, they have to isolate all of Northern Europe. So it's changed the requirements for the Russian general staff, and we have to keep pace. But remember, this is just the kinetic end of new generation warfare. The first 6 elements of new generation warfare are all non-kinetic. And that is the place where I think the Russians are making the most progress. You take a look at the presidential election in the United States, with the Russians putting Trump in the presidency. You take a look at how the Russians have used the S-400 to be able to isolate Turkey from NATO. The Russians are making great progress in terms of the non-kinetic instruments of warfare. I think the major point is while we are not at war with Russia, Putin is very much at war with us, and we're losing.
Just how about, we discussed, remember some time ago, the threat from the First Guards Army and from the Smolensk Gate. How would you, what would you say about that thing that, we have the spinning effect on Poland as opposed to Suwalki Corridor? If you just could elaborate on that issue a little bit.
Well, when you look at the evolution of the Zapad exercises in 1999, and it was essentially the idea being that they would seize the Baltic states and threaten Poland. and if necessary, they would take this northeast quadrant. They would use tactical nuclear weapons, and I mean very small tactical nuclear weapons. They could be as small as sub 0.2 of a kiloton to take down the bridges over the Vistula, isolate the whole area. And then their final of the scenarios, when those pesky Poles don't stop fighting, then you pop a nuke on the capital. And that surely will intimidate the rest of Europe to stop fighting. So even if the Poles wanted to continue to fight, the rest of Europe would turn to the United States and say, hey, we're done. No more. So that was 99. And in 2004, they were so confident that they thought the West wouldn't fight. In the exercise, they actually played the French and the Germans as staying neutral. So up through 2000, I'm sorry, not 2004, it was 99 and 2009. 2009, the second post-Cold War Zapad exercise. So after that, NATO began to take actions. And we saw the results with putting troops forward in the defense of the Baltic states, putting Americans in Poland, putting American troops next to Poles, so that there would be a greater likelihood that Americans, if the Russians use nuclear warheads, they would be targeting Americans as well as Poles. That's a very good strategy, because what it tells the Russians is that if you use nukes on Americans, you'll get them back. So, and they won't be discreet, small nukes. So that's, what we saw take place in 2009. So the Russian General Staff said, okay, we have to change the game again. So instead of using the 20th Army against Poland, they moved the 20th Army to the back, and they built as a reserve, and they developed the 1st Guards Tank Army. So the 1st Guards Tank Army was to be a fist to threaten Warsaw, so that they intended the 1st Guards Tank Army, which could move its combat elements from Russia to the Polish border in 36 hours. So
across Belarus. Across the Belarusian territory. Yeah?
Yes, across Belarusian territory. And so the whole idea was to bring them to the Polish border before Poland could do anything, or NATO allies could do anything, and intimidate Poland from going into the Baltic states. And so that was the Russian solution. Then what happened? You have the Swedes and the Finns begin to play with NATO and the European Union. And again, the General Staff said, oh my God, even if we intimidate the Poles, it doesn't end the war. The Russian General Staff's job is, how do you stop the war on favorable terms? And so that's how you ended up in 2017 with yet another strategy. And so all of these things are interrelated. You have Russians taking action. You have NATO responding, requiring the Russians to rethink and adjust their strategy, their force posture. And so it's an action-reaction thing. What always concerns me about that is, a lot of pacifists in the West would like to say, well, if it's action-reaction, then let's not give them an excuse. No. If you don't respond, then they have what they want. So what we have to do, is make sure the school bully doesn't take NATO's lunch money, because they'll keep taking the lunch money until you stand up to them.
So from what you're saying, we can, sort of derive that it's all about reactive response. What do you think about proactive action, some strategic signaling? I'll tell you an example, and that might find your favor, because we discuss also the Huma and Sarema deployments often between ourselves. Around a month ago, Polish forces deployed anti-ship coastal battery to Sarema as a show of force and as a strategic signaling to Russians that we can actually close the Gulf of Finland. and prevent seizure of those two islands. So what do you think, what the reactions of Russians and their planning could be to that recent proactive development?
Well, first of all, every single Zapad exercise involves the Russians seizing Sarma, okay? So, including 2017. So the whole point is that what the Poles have done is tell the Russians, we know that's important to you. And by bringing forces in there, and at such as you did, essentially what it does is it says, we're going to make the Baltic Sea. First of all, we're going to preempt your strategy, and we're going to turn the Baltic Sea into our European lake. So in terms of signaling, it's very powerful. But that raises the question, which we talk about all the time in our, that is the New Generation Warfare Center's exercises, is that every exercise NATO wins. We have always won in every exercise. But that's because we make certain assumptions. NATO political leaders make the decisions that allow NATO military leaders to do all the things that are necessary, like mobilizing the forces, like deploying them forward. You know, in one of our exercises here in Poland, the Polish side ordered a division to move to Warsaw from the other side of the Vistula. And I asked the Polish officer, how long will it take you to move that division into position to defend Warsaw? He says, we don't know. We've never tried. Well, the difference.
So actually what you are suggesting is that we should exercise deployment troops through Warsaw bridges, over the Vistula River, frequently during peacetime, just to show, you know, the potential.
Well, not just to show the Russians, but to learn how to do it. Let me tell you, it's not easy. Doing a road march of military formation is not easy. And if you don't practice it, you will not be successful. Okay?
So, you know, on that account, starting from January this year, some Polish units began exercising east of the Vistula River, moving along the roads, getting out of the traditional places where they exercise, just mixing with the terrain, mingling with the population, and just trying to find the places of potential tactical encounters, you know, engagements.
Well, and coming to understand...
What signals does it send? Also?
Well, I mean, it's a very powerful signal, because essentially what you're doing is you're reinforcing in the Russian General Staff's mind doubt. And what we want to have and happen in a crisis, when Putin is getting aggressive and he decides, well, I'm going to pull the trigger on an operation, we want the Russian General Staff to say to him, you're the boss, but we don't think it's a good idea, because we don't know if we can actually succeed. And that's, deterrence comes from causing your opponent to have doubt about whether or not they can succeed with what they have to do. See, we don't have a lot of plans because we're defending. We're not planning on liberating Moscow, okay? But maybe we should start to plan to liberate Kaliningrad or liberate Belarus.
To complicate their planning.
That's right. To make sure that they understand that once they start a cycle, there may not be any stopping it. And to come back to our exercises, we have to train our people. First of all, our politicians. Well, we back up. First of all, the military to think larger scale, okay, beyond cores, okay. And then we need to train our politicians the kinds of decisions they're going to have to make in order for the NATO forces to be in a position to succeed. And in our games, all those decisions are affirmative, and therefore NATO can win. And the truth is, The Russians can't beat us. The only people that can beat us is us. We can beat us by not preparing to defend our countries.
Yeah. You were also, taking some trips in Poland and I'm sure analyzed the line of the Vistula River. So what would you say about this operational or strategic obstacle? And, I mean, what does, how does it, what sort of bearing does it have on planning any war operations in Poland?
Well, from the Russian perspective, I believe their concern is using it as a barrier against NATO. So isolating, when we were looking at the Zapad 2009 exercise, and we're looking at the nuclear strikes on the bridges, and we noted, oh my God, that looks just like us during the Cold War, when we were using nuclear weapons on those very same points.
You mean on the Vistula River?
On the Vistula, to prevent the Russian second strategic echelon from moving forward. Now the Russians are doing exactly what we were doing to prevent NATO second echelon and actually first echelon forces moving into position.
Phil, before we move, we'll continue that because you were there on the watchtower in the 80s, yeah?
Yes.
I remember our conversation. So you were analyzing where to strike.
That's right. That's right.
So you were analyzing the territory of Poland,
Poland and East Germany in particular, yes.
Could you say a little bit more? That might be an interesting, sort of a...
Well, one of the interesting things was we're going back to an exercise that we did in the United States. I was actually playing the Red Force in the exercise. And so during the exercise, when we were going to actually use the actual real live strike plane, nuclear strike plane, I looked at it and I says, this is insane. It's a political act. The nuclear strike plane was a political act to attack all of the Warsaw Pact, which would have, in my opinion, only unified the Warsaw Pact, when what we really needed to do was because remember, the Russians, during the Cold War, and even now, the Russians think about shifting the correlation of forces by suppressing NATO fixed-wing assets on the main operating bases. So you do that, back then they did it by running the Воздушные операции, an air operation. And that meant that the Russian frontal aviation airfields, there were 10 of them in Germany, in East Germany, were fundamental. So instead of using 20 weapons to piss off all of the Warsaw Pact, I suggested they use only 10 weapons and target those Russian or Soviet airfields in East Germany. And the idea being it would dramatically alter the correlation of forces. It would dramatically avoid unifying the Warsaw Pact by telling all the non-Soviet allies, you just saw what happened. Do you want this to happen on your territory, or are you going to quit? So, and I watched the debate, and all the NATO ambassadors were playing their own countries in the exercise. And the German ambassador said, absolutely not. Germany is not going to pay, because West Germany considered their own people to be East Germany. So they said, no, 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 you can't attack just Germans. Not just Germans can die. Now, that was a real political reality in an exercise. My own opinion at the time was that, in truth, the Germans would have been the last country to allow us or to vote in favor of using any nuclear weapons. It was fine in an exercise. But in the real world, in a crisis, I don't think that they would have been in favor of it. I think they would have opposed it. Now, the truth is, I think the United States and the exercise did what it needed to do for politics. And the real world, I think the United States would have done what was smart.
I understand. So there was planning of strikes against bridges on the Vistula River.
Absolutely.
Nuclear strikes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so you knew all those bridges
Yes.
spanning two parts of Poland.
I never saw them except from satellite. But now I've gone out and walked around each of your bridges.
Nice.
But at the time, we watched them on satellite. We identified, and we watched Russian exercises in Poland in terms of securing those bridges for second echelon forces, second strategic echelon forces moving forward.
So how are they doing it?
Well, they were preparing to defend those bridges from airstrikes, and also they were concerned. The 10th Special Forces, U.S. at the time, the Cold War, U.S. 10th Special Forces was Polish-speaking unit. It was to be inserted into Poland to help generate resistance inside Poland and to strike those very things, those very bridges, etc.
Interesting. So what would you say about, the sort of how, Kuklinski, the story of Kuklinski, how did that, impact the U.S. planning? I mean, what was his role in that way?
Well, initially all those materials were held by the CIA, and they could not leave the country. They were when you read a document, you had to sign that you read it. Very few analysts had access to it. And Kuklinski was a major contributor. There were 10 Russian sources, all of whom ended up being compromised and executed. Kuklinski was the only guy who survived. So those 11 people, I believe, helped change the outcome of the Cold War. And the story was that the propensity in Washington at the time was to think that the Russians were dying to use nuclear weapons, no pun intended. When in truth, Marshal Ogarkov was trying to find a way to win a conflict before the West could use nuclear weapons to change the outcome of the conflict. If it wasn't going to change the outcome, then why would we use them? So the best chance of avoiding nuclear holocaust was to collapse NATO quickly in 4 to 5 days and do it without the use of nuclear weapons. So a fellow by the name of John Hines, who was an Army major when he and I started working, and then he was promoted subsequently to colonel. But we put together, and actually with the help of an Air Force officer by the name of John Clark, who at that time was a captain, he too became a colonel. We put together briefings, and Clark and I brought the briefing to Europe to brief our allies. And before the U.S. could brief any intelligence briefing to our NATO allies, we had to run it through the DSAC-UR, who was, the DSINC-UR, Deputy Commander of Forces Europe, U.S. Forces. And at that time, it was Willie Y. Smith. And Smith heard the briefing, and he says, no way in hell you're going to share that briefing with our allies. You're just going to scare the hell out of them. And so I asked his staff, I says, is he used to this particular source of material? And I'm not going to use the code name because I'm not sure the code name has been cleared. But Gordon, the only reason I can tell the story is because Gordon Barras has written the story up in his book, The Great Cold War. Otherwise, I couldn't even tell you this story. The staff said he doesn't see the material. His intelligence officer said he doesn't see the material. I said, what the hell is this? One of our senior NATO officers, and he hasn't seen this very sensitive material. So I asked him if he would, on his next visit to the United States, if he would give me a chance to show him my evidence. And I went back to the States and thought, it's not going to amount to anything. And one day I get a call that Smith wants to meet me in the tank in the Pentagon, which is the most secure facility. So I gathered my materials and I brought John Hines with me rather than Clark, because John was more familiar with the operational maneuver group research. And
the Soviets were deploying, you know, the concept of the Soviets to use those groups.
Yeah, the idea of deep raiding, but not raiding like we think of a raiding where you go out and come back. Their notion of raid was to go deep, seize key objectives like river lines, and then the front line would catch up with them. So it was different. One of the problems with helping people understand is the Russians or the Soviets is we use the same words, but they mean different things. And so one has to be very careful in not misleading people. So essentially, we just showed General Smith the material, excerpts from the material. And he said, has Bernie Rogers seen this? The SAC-year? We don't think so. You didn't see it. So probably he didn't see it. He said, you need to brief this. I said, I'm sorry, this material can't go abroad. And he says, don't tell me the senior American military commander can't have the material flowing to him. And he was right. So the materials, our materials were flown to Rogers on his personal plane.
And that was based on the Kuklinski's
Kuklinski
findings,
was, yes, that's right. Part of, it was all 11 people, including Kuklinski. And so we just, went through the materials and you know the story. When I was trying to rush Rogers through it, he made clear to me, shut up, let him take his time. And because his chief of staff was trying to rush me through the materials. And then just so happened that the Shapex 82, I think it comes in April of 82, the major briefing of all the major NATO subordinate commands was going to be at NATO headquarters. And he said, I want you to be able to brief this. But I said, well, we can't show them the evidence. He says, tell the story. And it'll be my briefing, my name, his name. But we will do the briefing. So we went back and we put together the briefing telling the same story, but we illustrated. For example, we said, okay, what are the Russians doing to get the operational maneuver group through the forward defenses, NATO, forward defense of 50 kilometers in depth. They added a fire phase. They increased artillery firepower by 50%. What they did, in the Russians, propensity for regimented thinking, gave us the opportunity to illustrate it. Because what they did is they added an extra battery to every regiment, and what they ended up doing by adding artillery and mechanizing it, in order to keep pace with the force, they increased the firepower by 50%. And we had proven it because we'd say, here's a satellite picture of this area. And you can see, here are the number of tubes 2 years ago. Here are the number of tubes today. Because the Russians had everything laid out, parked, so that you could see it all. So we used satellite photography to illustrate everything and gave the briefing. And then he sent us around to all the major NATO subordinate commands. And we went to U.S. intel in Europe. We had a problem. And so he called the general up and he says, I'm going to send them back to you. And this time, be in the listening mode. And so we went back, briefed him on a Saturday. He was out of uniform. He took his shoes off, he put his feet up on the table, and he said, I'm ready to listen. And so, but that whole procedure made us think about a different problem, which became directly related to what we talked about earlier in the collapse of the Soviet economy. Think about this. When you had towed tubes, and it was 2/3 of what Olgarkov had, that was one problem, keeping pace. Because remember, every time the artillery moves forward, the ammunition has to move. But if it's towed and there's 1/3 less, that's one thing. But when you mechanize it and you add another third and it's all moving, how do you move all that artillery, all that ammunition? Well, you have to have trucks. And so Olgarkov began to forward deploy trucks. And he took all the means by which to move agricultural products in the Soviet Union from the field to the consumer. So by the time the Soviet, by 1983, 50% of all the agricultural products didn't, not depended, it was really, between 40 and 60% depending on the crop, but the average was 50% of the agricultural produce never made it from the fields to the consumer because there was no means by which to move the product. And so what the Russians did was they bought all the grain from the United States to make up. But it didn't solve the problem because they came to port and there was no trucks to move them from the port to the people. So 50% of the grain that we sold to the Russians, the Soviets, then spoiled as well. So what we were watching and preparing our military for was exactly the same thing which turned around and led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, General Rogers developed follow-on forces attack, FOFA, based on this briefing, which was based, at least largely in part, on Kuklinski. So when Brzezinski said Kuklinski was the first Polish NATO, first Polish officer in NATO, he was right. That's exactly what he was referring to, because Brzezinski was well aware of all this stuff.
Interesting. So how do you feel nowadays when you see the same rivers and cities and towns that you saw on the satellites, and now you're, analyzing how to sort of defeat Russians potentially entering this zone?
Well, the same frustration. I feel the same frustration.
What do you mean?
Well, we've been fighting in the bushes against, terrorists. We're fighting in the deserts, and we have forgotten and are only in the last 2 or 3 years relearning how to fight large-scale, near-peer enemies. But I would caution you on the term near peer. That suggests that the Russians are near to us. In fact, we're near to them, okay? Because we did not build the Crusader. So we did not build the artillery piece that was supposed to accompany the M1. The Russians did build all that armor. And to my knowledge, I may be wrong, but to my knowledge, there's no T-90 has yet been destroyed in the Donbass. Okay, T-72s, yes, but not a T-90. And what about the T-14? Right? So all of the Russians have been doing all this stuff. Yes, their forces are a lot smaller. Everybody's forces are smaller. The forces defending this part of the world that we talked about in our book, Baltic states and this quadrant of Poland, is about 1/4 this ratio scale it was during the Cold War. So there's a lot more space to maneuver. The Russians have modernized their artillery, so they're much longer range.
So they can maneuver with fire.
They can maneuver with fires, and they can support forces not shoulder to shoulder. So I can support with my fires the maneuver of the next force over, even though we're not
in touch.
So all of this has changed the nature of warfare, and we are making progress. NATO is we did the first exercise, which was for the first course size exercise, which was in England for the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps. And then we went, General Williams, who's now at the West Point, but he was then at Landcom, brought us to Landcom to help his people sort of prepare for the first multi-corps exercise. But we're still not where we need to be in terms of the level, the scale of operations. That it takes commands a lot of time to learn how to command, these headquarters.
Sizable units.
That's right. And so we've started, but we still have a long way to go. And we have to relearn the lessons, the frustrations that I'm having. Poland is a perfect example. The previous defense minister here understood that Poland needs to fight with the U.S. Army. It had to fight and defend Poland has to have U.S. Army here. Well, to really operate as a maneuver force with the U.S. Army, you need to look like the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army is not an expeditionary force. It does not use a helicopter as a fire support. It uses it as a maneuver element. The problem in the alliance is nobody is looking at what our requirements are. They're looking at shiny objects. The Polish Air Force looks at Kaliningrad and says, we can't work with the F-16. We have to have stealth aircraft. Okay.
To penetrate the air defense, you mean?
And that makes sense. But how are you going to defend yourself against what is now called the aerospace operation? Same purpose, to suppress fixed-wing assets at your airfields. How many of your aircraft are sheltered? How many of your main operating bases have underground storage for fuel, or underground storage or bunkered, not underground necessarily, but bunkered storage for your munitions? How much munitions do you have? Can you actually fight more than 24 hours? How many rapid runway repair kits do you have at each of your main operating bases? Have you practiced I can't think of the term. What's the term when you disperse your aircraft? The idea of dispersing your aircraft to other fields. Well, it's fine. It protects them, but you can't run combat operations unless you have flight crews that can go to those places, ability to move the ammunition and the fuel to those places. And so essentially the idea of putting all your Polish investment in the basket of F-35s, if it means you're just buying expensive targets, again, we got to start thinking about war fighting, not the so-called idea of deterrence, because deterrence is in the eye of the beholder. We need to deter the Russians from their perspective, not by we have capacity, right? And it's just
so when I'm just speaking of the larger scale, and given the terrain of war of Poland, the Vistula River, and all those assets, and the modern battlefields, symmetrical battlefield that you have mentioned, how would you posture? How would you deploy the army, and what operational concepts would you prepare Polish forces for?
I think that Poland should be defending its borders at the border, but not with units all sitting up crowded. In other words, you need to make sure that the Russians understand the minute they cross into Poland, there is going to be contact. And you will fight a mobile defense. And by the way, do you know who it was that first invented mobile defense? It was invented by German and Romanian forces in Romania against the Russians. U.S. Army studies mobile defense It studies Romanian experience when they defeated the Russians in the Second World War during the first Kishinev attack, so or operation. So you went mobile defense, and the other thing is we need to say not just that we will defend, but we will counterattack. So if you come west from Belarus, we won't just defend Belarus. We're going to go north and take Kaliningrad. So it's that idea that we're not going to let you sit there nice and secure saying, oh, that's our territory, and we'll go nuclear if you touch our territory. Wrong. If you kill Poles, Poles are going to kill Russians, and not in Poland or just in Poland. That's what will have the greatest impact on Russian general staff thinking. You know, you want to get inside the mind and communicate in a way that Marshal, Mahmoud Gareev thinks, okay? Because he's still whispering in the ear of Putin. So you want to whisper in his ear.
I understand. So what capabilities would you build then?
Well,
in order to, execute what you were just suggesting?
Well, I think that Poland, I'm in favor of Poland modernizing its Air Force, but it means a smaller Air Force. You have to protect those very valuable assets, which means all the assets need to be over on the German border. They need to practice deploying to other fields. They need to be bunkered. The Russians, let's face it, the Russians are going to get the first strike. NATO's not going to preempt, okay? So the Russians will strike first. But when they do, they need to understand we can ride out that first strike and then, Katie bar the door. Because when the Russian aircraft are recovering at their home airfields, they're going to get hammered wherever they recover. Okay? We don't care if they recover in Kaliningrad or in Russia proper. They will be hammered at their home air bases. If they go there, if they redeploy to other airfields, they'll be hammered there. So you need F-35, but it can't be an expensive target. It's got to be part of a structured package, and it of necessity will be smaller so you can afford the other things. Okay?
How about other elements like tanks? What sort of formations and where would you deploy during peacetime?
I'm not a big fan. I was trained as an infantry officer back during the Cold War. I'm not a big fan of handheld anti-tank weapons. Okay, and the reason is because have you ever maneuvered in a field against a maneuvering tank? It's scary. Those things are monsters. And they can even run over their own troops, okay? Because they can't see and they're protecting themselves all the time. So the best anti-tank weapon is a high velocity gun, all right? So you need tanks. If you want to defeat Russian tanks, you need tanks. Now the Ukrainians have demonstrated an alternative, at least against the T-72s. They use 1.52 howitzers as a direct fire weapon. And when they hit a Russian tank, it picks up the turret right off the tank.
By impact, by sheer impact.
Just by impact. It just picks the turret right off. Right? So, but if you're in a shootout between unarmored 1.52 artillery and armored tanks, who do you think is going to win? Okay? So Ukrainian troops have shown amazing courage by defending their infantry with direct fire artillery. Let me tell you, that takes a lot of guts to do when you get into a direct firefight with T-72 and even T-90 tanks. Because the Russians usually back up an attack of T-90s with oversight by, or T-72s with oversight by a T-90. Okay, so you need tanks. You need a high velocity gun. That's the only way to take on the Russian armor, especially with these new, they have these new rocket weapons.
Active protection.
Active protection, which are essentially like a shotgun, destroying the warheads of a slow-moving handheld weapon. High-velocity gun, that's not going to help with, okay? And you can put all the armor on it you want, but a high-velocity gun is your answer. So you have to have that.
And how would you deploy? I mean, what sort of posture deploy?
Well,
given the territory of Poland.
You need to. I think we need to emulate the Russians. You know, they use this new form of formation, which is weighted toward artillery. So if you don't, there's no point in having artillery unless it's mechanized. It has to be able to move. So
if you're steady, you die. Yeah.
Yeah. You cannot. We're really talking about mobile warfare. You said take your armored units, and you should have approximately 1/3 artillery mechanized, 1/3 tanks, 1/3 mechanized infantry, and we need to get heavier infantry fighting vehicles. Both the Romanians, I'm sorry, not the Romanians, the Ukrainians and the Russians are developing armored fighting vehicles which are the same armored protection as the tank. Because if you take a look at the Donbass, pictures of the Donbass, you always see the troops riding on top of the armored vehicles, right? Why? Because they know riding inside is a death trap. And what it was the American solution to that problem? Well, we just upgunned the vehicles, so now they have 30 millimeter guns.
You mean strikers? Huh? Yeah.
Oh, no, it's on some armored vehicles. But the point is, all they do is shred those vehicles. That when the fighting starts, the driver and the gunner have about 60 seconds, okay, before they're dead. Okay. And they shred each other. And that's why both sides have to be in a position of, tanks are blind without infantry. So they have to keep infantry with them that they can deploy. The only way to do that is with a heavy armored vehicle. Either Poland needs to take some of its older tanks, convert them, or build, like the Ukrainians have designed, a tank armored kind of infantry fighting vehicle.
Yeah, because otherwise infantry is separated from the tanks.
That's right.
So it inflicts some problems of friction of movements and, attack.
But everybody's going to be infantry short. Okay? Pure and simple. That's the nature of modern warfare today. All the forces are going to be operating infantry short. They're going to have to be autonomous. They're going to have lots of firepower. And that's why the Russians have used this approach, even down to companies now, okay? As they used to have the battalion tactical groups, which is what I was talking about. Now they have company tactical groups. They've replaced infantry with artillery. And, by the way, they've also added anti-aircraft weapons. And because they understand that they're going to have to defend themselves autonomously out of the cover, because in the first probably no more than 4 days, all the Russian strategic SAMs will be gone. They will either have been destroyed or used up, which means that the armored forces are going to have to be able to protect themselves. And so that's why you and I have talked in the past about the idea of Patriot. Does it really make sense to invest so heavily in Patriot? Because it's more expensive to shoot down tactical weapons with a Patriot than it is to build more tactical surface missiles. So it doesn't seem like, we have to think about mobility, because survivability comes from mobility. That means air power essentially certainly during the first 4 to 5 days of the conflict is going to be rotary. I mean, if the Polish army thinks it's going to see fixed-wing aircraft in support in the first 4 to 5 days, they are smoking dope. That's why they need to go back and revisit this notion, not against the F-35. I'm in favor of the F-35, but there has to be balance. You know, go talk to the Dutch, the Netherlands. They have the F-35 bunkered, underground fuel, bunkered ammunition, and they're buying the newest Apache. So they're a country, small army, small country. They understand what modern warfare is like. They got it.
Yeah.
So they can teach everyone a lesson.
Before we end, Phil, let me ask the last question. You know, you saw the terrain east of Warsaw, between the border of Belarus and Poland, and Poland, and between the border, Terespol and Warsaw. What would you say about this terrain, those towns and places? Probably that might be the place where all this, you know, will play out, yeah?
Well, I'm a historian, as you know, and how does one capture Warsaw? From the east or the west?
Yeah, of course, usually from the west.
From the west, and there's only, you know, if you take a look at Tukhachevsky's plan, which was a good plan, okay, he had a disadvantage. He had Prussia to his north. The Russians today have Kaliningrad to their north. And I've talked to Polish generals about, you know, a Russian thrust south from Kaliningrad. And they say, oh, the Lake Country. I believe a lot of that is old wives' tales. I'm not saying the terrain is difficult. It is difficult in places, maybe nearly impossible in places. But if you get out and walk, I'd like to know how many Polish general officers have actually gotten out and walked the terrain like we have. Right? It's not impossible. And whenever the first mistake is to think it's something is impossible for the enemy to do. If you do that, you're asking for trouble, because nothing is impossible. We're always talking about gradients of difficulty. Right? And the problem, or the difference now between Tukhachevsky's encirclement and capture of Warsaw and the contemporary Russian planning, is that they have half the distance to go with a much more mobile, high-speed force. And so I think that this is a very real issue. You know, when we published a book up at the Baltic Defense College, and the commandant there was telling the students, he says, look, you guys go home almost every weekend. Don't just drive those roads to get home, but take time to get out of the car and take a look at the terrain and the river lines. You know, you look at a map and you see a river. Okay. Maybe it's a barrier, maybe it's not, based upon the size. Or maybe you can, if it's on a map, you know, something you could cross with a tactical bridge. Go look at the banks. Maybe you can't cross it. Take a look. You have the longest wild river in Europe, okay? Try to cross that river without engineering. I never found a place you could cross it with bridges. You have to have, you know, tactical bridges. You have to have engineering. And one of the things the Russian army doesn't have today is it doesn't have, you know, it's so much smaller. It doesn't have the engineering capacity. It doesn't have the bridging capacity. So it is limited to where it can cross, what it can do. And so we need to start looking at, I would ask, you know, the question here in Poland, is every bridge in our book prepared for demolition? If it's pre-chambered, has adequate engineers been deployed, trained and prepared to blow those bridges? Do you have adequate explosives assigned for that? Where are they located? all those are military technical questions. And then, of course, the tough questions, because those are all the easy questions. The tough questions are, what politician is going to give you the authority to pull those bridges? Okay, because you better be right if you're going to persuade him to take one of those bridges down. So those are the kinds of things that we need to at least be talking about. And one of the things I appreciate about you know, Jacek, is that you are talking about these kinds of things, and that's the beginning. You know, the Chinese say every journey begins with a first step. The first step is to begin to talk about the problem and not be like kids who want to buy shiny toys. Okay. We got to understand first, what is the problem and what does Poland need? And it can't win alone. It has to fight with the United States. It has to fight with Sweden. It has to fight with the UK. And so what's the best force structure and posture here to be able to receive Allied forces? That's why this new airport, I believe, is absolutely critical. It's an opportunity to change the strategic situation in Central Europe. If you build that airport with a plan that it will be a central hub that will receive forces, not heavy equipment, all that stuff all the American heavy equipment should be pre-deployed here. There's no reason for us to have that excess equipment out in the desert. That should all be over here. You should be negotiating with the Americans what you'll do to maintain it. American battalions. We should have American, actually we should have a rotational brigade, which amounts to a division. One just got here. One just went home. One is getting ready to come. You have a division, but you have to have all that equipment already here. And when each brigade comes, it pulls the poles pull the equipment out, fuel it, arm it. When the plane lands, they march off the plane, they get in their equipment, and they drive off to the front. And you only can do that if you practice it. We did that in the reforger exercises. We need to revisit that whole experience. None of this is mystery. We've done it before. We know how to do it. We just have to remember what we did and then practice it, because nobody succeeds without practice.
Thank you, Phil, very much. That was awesome. Thanks.
Thanks for your time.